I sat perfectly still as 12 hands went up into the air. My mother-in-law had just asked our entire extended family to vote on whether I should be permanently banned from the family. They all voted yes. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just looked at the lavish dining room around us, a room paid for by the very restaurant empire I secretly owned. Before I tell you how I legally evicted them from their own lives just 7 days later, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind toxic in-laws exactly who holds the real power. I am Maya, 34 years old, and a corporate crisis manager based in Atlanta. I spend my days dismantling hostile takeovers, handling public relations disasters, and negotiating multi-million-dollar settlements. I am trained to remain absolutely calm when everything around me is burning to the ground. But nothing in my professional career could have prepared me for the emotional ambush waiting for me at the Caldwell family estate in Buckhead. It was Thanksgiving Day. The sprawling brick mansion was suffocatingly warm, filled with the rich scents of roasted turkey collard greens and candied yams. It had been exactly 2 years since my husband Marcus passed away in a tragic car accident. This was the first major holiday I had agreed to spend with his family since his funeral. I only came because I wanted to keep his memory alive for our young son, but sitting at that massive mahogany dining table, I quickly realized I had walked into a highly coordinated trap. The Caldwell family was basically royalty in our local community. They were the proud owners of Caldwell's Heritage, an upscale soul food restaurant chain that had been a staple in Atlanta for decades. My mother-in-law, Beatrice Caldwell, built her entire identity on being the powerful matriarch of that business and a highly respected pillar of her mega church. To the outside world, she was a devout, generous, and loving woman. But behind closed doors, Beatrice was a master manipulator who ruled her family through financial control and emotional intimidation. From the day Marcus brought me home, Beatrice made it clear I was an outsider. I did not come from their prestigious social circles. I wore tailored silk suits instead of extravagant church hats, and I prioritized my independent career over joining the family restaurant business. Marcus was her golden child, and she deeply resented that he chose a woman who refused to bow to her authority. When he died, the invisible thread tying me to her grace snapped entirely. The dinner had been tense from the start. I sat near the middle of the long table, quietly cutting my food while listening to the forced, superficial chatter. Beatrice sat at the head of the table wearing a burgundy silk dress, her signature pearl necklace gleaming under the crystal chandelier. She spent the first hour of the meal holding court, boasting to the extended family about her latest church donations and the supposed record-breaking profits of the restaurants. I knew the actual financial numbers of her business were a disaster, but I kept my mouth shut and focused on my plate. We had just finished the main course when the atmosphere in the room abruptly shifted. The low hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware suddenly felt incredibly heavy. Beatrice reached out with a manicured hand and picked up her silver fork. She tapped it sharply against her crystal wine glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the room like a siren. Everyone froze. The cheerful chatter of my aunts, uncles, and cousins died down instantly. Beatrice cleared her throat and stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her dress. Her eyes locked directly onto mine. The look she gave me was a chilling combination of absolute triumph and deep-seated disdain. Family, she began, her voice projecting with the practiced cadence of a seasoned preacher. Thanksgiving is a time for gratitude. It is a time to reflect on our blessings and thank the Lord for keeping us together. But it is also a time to protect the sanctity of our traditions. She paused, letting the silence stretch out, making sure every single eye in the room was fixed on her. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My instincts as a crisis manager kicked in, warning me that a targeted attack was underway. Since my beloved son Marcus went to be with the Lord, the dynamic at this table has shifted drastically. Beatrice continued, her voice taking on a sorrowful, dramatic tone. We have all tried our hardest to embrace his widow. We have extended grace. We have offered our prayers. But Maya has grown cold. She does not participate in our church fundraisers. She actively avoids our Sunday dinners. And quite frankly, her blatant disrespect for how this family operates is casting a dark, toxic cloud over our gatherings. I sat perfectly still, my face a carefully blank mask. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. The audacity of her words was breathtaking. I had skipped her Sunday dinners because they always devolved into interrogations about my finances and unsolicited critiques of my parenting. I skipped her church fundraisers because she only used them as photo opportunities to show off her wealth to the congregation. It is clear to me and to many of you who have spoken to me in private that Maya no longer wishes to honor the Caldwell name Beatrice proclaimed, raising her chin. She operates as if she is above us, as if the very family that welcomed her is now beneath her notice. We cannot allow this negative energy to poison our family legacy. We must protect our peace and preserve the joy of our household. She took a deep breath, her eyes flashing with pure malice. Therefore, for the emotional well-being of this family, I am calling for a formal family vote. I propose that Maya be officially and permanently excluded from all future Caldwell events, holidays, and family matters. The words hung in the warm, food-scented air. It was a direct public execution of my place in the family. I did not gasp. I did not defend myself. I did not beg for an explanation. I just looked around the table waiting to see who would be brave enough to speak up against this absolute madness. Instead of objections, I watched a horrific display of loyalty to the Caldwell wealth. One by one, hands began to go up into the air. Beatrice raised her hand first, holding it high and proud. Then, my sister-in-law Jasmine raised hers. Her lips curled into a nasty, satisfied smirk. This was a woman whose designer handbag I had personally paid off just 6 months ago to save her from a collection agency. Next to her, aunts and cousins slowly raised their hands. These were the same relatives I had hosted at my own home, the same people who had smiled in my face and hugged me when I walked through the door just 2 hours earlier. I watched 12 hands raised high above the dining table, 12 people voting to completely erase me from the family. The room was dead silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The tension was so thick it felt hard to breathe. They were all staring at me, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to shout, waiting for me to give them the angry, defensive reaction that would justify their cruelty. But I simply sat there, absorbing the ultimate betrayal, my mind already calculating my next move. The silence that followed the raising of those 12 hands was heavy and suffocating. No one dared to breathe. I kept my posture rigid, and my expression entirely unreadable. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply sat there absorbing the ultimate betrayal, my mind already calculating my next move. Then the oppressive silence was broken by Connor. He slowly lowered his hand and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the fine lace tablecloth. Connor was Jasmine's husband, a white man who had moved into the Caldwell family orbit 5 years ago and essentially never left. He was a master of using progressive modern therapy language to mask his absolute entitlement and profound laziness. He wore a trendy linen shirt and a carefully trimmed beard, adopting a look of deep, performative empathy that made my stomach churn. "Maya, you have to understand where we are coming from." Connor began, his voice soft and patronizing. He clasped his hands together as if he were guiding a group meditation rather than participating in the public excommunication of his sister-in-law. "We are all on a healing journey here. Losing Marcus was incredibly traumatizing for this entire family, and we have been trying to navigate that grief together. But your energy lately has just been incredibly toxic." I did not blink. I let him keep talking mentally, adding his words to the long list of debts this family was about to repay. "You have isolated yourself," he continued, shaking his head sadly. "You did not allow us to hold space for your mourning. Instead, you threw yourself into your career. We are really trying to cultivate a safe space for healing and generational wealth building within the Caldwell family. Your toxic independence is a trigger for us. It creates a hostile environment. You refuse to rely on the family structure, and it makes everyone feel undervalued. We just need to protect our peace." Generational wealth building. The phrase almost made me laugh out loud. Connor had not held a steady job in 3 years. He spent his days pitching failed startup ideas while living rent-free in a townhouse owned by Beatrice. The audacity of this man lecturing me about wealth building while eating a turkey paid for by my silent financial interventions was staggering. Jasmine immediately jumped in to back up her husband. She nodded vigorously, her heavy gold bangles clanking loudly against the wooden table. Exactly, she chimed in, pointing a manicured acrylic nail in my direction. You act like you are better than us, just because you run your little corporate consulting firm downtown. You think because you wear expensive suits and mingle with executives that you can look down your nose at our traditions. Jasmine's face twisted with a bitter, visceral jealousy that had been brewing since the day Marcus first introduced me to the family. You are a widow, Maya. She spat, her voice growing louder and more aggressive. You should be leaning on us. You should be seeking our guidance. Instead, you walk around acting like you run the world. You make everyone in this house uncomfortable because you refuse to play your part. You think you are untouchable, but you forget that you are only sitting at this table because my brother fell in love with you. Without Marcus, you are just a guest who overstayed her welcome. I stared at Jasmine. My expression remained stone cold, but inside a furious fire was beginning to burn. I stared at this woman who lived entirely for social media validation. I knew for a fact that her credit cards regularly declined at local grocery stores. I knew because I was the one who had quietly written a check to stop her luxury SUV from being repossessed just 6 months ago. I did it to protect my late husband's family name, keeping her embarrassing financial ruin a secret from the very aunts and uncles sitting around this table. Yet here she was, aggressively lecturing me about family roles and my supposed arrogance. The sheer hypocrisy in the room was suffocating. I looked past Jasmine and Connor, scanning the faces of the extended relatives. My aunts and uncles, people who had gladly accepted my financial help, my gifts and my hospitality over the years, now sat with their eyes averted. They stared at their plates, too cowardly to speak up against Beatrice, too comfortable in their complicity. They had traded their loyalty for Beatrice's approval, completely unaware that Beatrice's empire was a hollow shell. I was fully prepared to sit through the rest of this pathetic display in silence. I was prepared to let them finish their self-righteous speeches, gather my things, and quietly walk out the door. I had dealt with hostile boardrooms and ruthless corporate raiders. A dining table full of delusional narcissists was nothing I could not handle. But then a small trembling hand tugged urgently at the sleeve of my silk blazer. I turned my head and looked down at my son. Leo was 8 years old, a brilliant, sensitive boy who looked so much like his father that it sometimes made my heart ache. He had been sitting quietly beside me this entire time, obediently eating his dinner. Now his fork lay abandoned on his plate. His big brown eyes were wide with confusion, fear, and profound hurt. His lower lip quivered uncontrollably, and heavy tears were spilling down his cheeks, dropping onto the collar of his crisp white shirt. He did not understand the complex web of financial control and jealousy that ruled his grandmother's actions, but he understood exactly what it meant when an entire room full of people raised their hands against his mother. "Mom." Leo sobbed, his voice cracking. The sound pierced through the heavy tension in the dining room. "Why are they doing this? Why does Grandma hate us?" My heart shattered. The cold, calculated armor I wore for my profession instantly melted away, replaced by the fierce, protective instinct of a mother. I reached out and pulled him against my side, wrapping my arms securely around his small, shaking shoulders. I kissed the top of his head, murmuring softly to calm him, doing my best to shield him from the toxic energy radiating from the people across the table. The sound of a grieving child crying should have invoked at least some level of basic human compassion. It should have shamed them. It should have made Beatrice realize that her cruel power play was damaging her own grandson. Instead, Beatrice's mask of devout Christian righteousness vanished completely. Her eyes narrowed into furious slits. She slammed her hand flat against the mahogany table with a loud, violent smack. The fine crystal glasses and silver cutlery rattled against the porcelain plates. "Leo, stop that whining right this instant," Beatrice snapped. Her voice was harsh, entirely devoid of any grandmotherly warmth or patience. "I will not tolerate a crying child ruining my Thanksgiving dinner." Leo flinched, burying his face into my blazer, his small body trembling against mine. Beatrice pointed a long, accusing finger directly at my son. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she declared loudly to the rest of the table. "Look at how weak he is. This is grown folks' business and he is interrupting. You act just as spoiled, arrogant, and disrespectful as your mother. Marcus would be absolutely ashamed to see how soft and undisciplined you are raising this boy, Maya. The air in the room seemed to freeze. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a countdown to an explosion. Mentioning my dead husband was a dangerous line to cross. Using his name to emotionally abuse his only child was a declaration of war. A physiological shift happened inside my body. The rational patient part of my brain shut down entirely. The grace I had extended to this family out of respect for the man I loved evaporated into thin air. Every ounce of restraint I possessed vanished. They had wanted to push me to see how much abuse I would silently absorb just to maintain the illusion of family harmony. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my refusal to engage in their petty screaming matches meant I was defenseless. They were catastrophically wrong. The absolute final boundary had been crossed. Attacking me was one thing. I could weather their jealousy, their fake therapy buzzwords, and their pathetic power trips. But terrorizing my son and weaponizing his dead father's memory against him was an unforgivable offense. I stopped comforting Leo for a brief second and slowly lifted my head to look directly at Beatrice. The expression on my face must have been terrifying because Connor visibly shifted backward in his chair and Jasmine's smug smile instantly vanished. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream or throw a plate to command the room. True power is quiet, and the fury I felt was absolute zero. The game of being the polite, accommodating widow was officially over. I pushed my chair back. The heavy mahogany legs scraped against the vintage Persian rug with a loud, grating sound that made several people around the table flinch. I stood up slowly, my posture impeccably straight, towering over the seated family members who had just eagerly voted for my exile. I reached down and took Leo by his small, trembling hand, pulling him gently away from the table and pressing him securely against my side. "Protecting your safe space?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yet it echoed through the cavernous dining room with terrifying clarity. "Is that what you call this? Beatrice?" Beatrice opened her mouth to issue another command, but the sheer intensity in my eyes stopped the words in her throat. "You invoke my dead husband's name to justify bullying his 8-year-old son." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "You speak of generational wealth and family traditions while acting like a fragile, insecure tyrant. You want to talk about safe spaces, just like how you protected your safe space last year by banning me from the ribbon-cutting ceremony of your new restaurant location, purely because you were terrified I would wear a dress that outshone Jasmine. You are not protecting this family. You are protecting your ego." I turned my gaze to Connor, who immediately broke eye contact and stared intently at his half-eaten slice of turkey. "And you, Connor, keep the word toxic out of your mouth. The only thing toxic in this room is the staggering amount of entitlement coming from a man who has not paid a single